Escape from New York is a 1981 film directed by John Carpenter and written by Carpenter and Nick Castle. In the future, the island of Manhattan has been transformed into a massive prison. Escape is nearly impossible due to a wall, a bridge with explosives, and round-the-clock surveillance and helicopters as lethal guards. On the way to a peace summit between the United States and the Soviet Union, the president's plane, Air Force One, is hijacked by anti-imperialist revolutionaries. The president crashes into the city-wide prison and is taken hostage in exchange for release and amnesty of all prisoners. Snake Plissken, a former Special Forces soldier and current convict, is tasked with retrieving the president. If he is unable to do so within 24 hours, Plissken will be killed by micro-explosives injected into his body. If he is successful, he will be pardoned. After a long and bloody mission, Plissken recovers the president from the de facto ruler and gang leader of New York, the Duke. Following the rescue, the president attempts to give a speech to the peace summit, but this is sabotaged by Plissken, who feels betrayed by the country he once served. Escape from New York is a distinctly American film, not just because it was predominantly made by and starring Americans like so many other Hollywood films, but because its setting, themes, politics, and atmosphere were of the American zeitgeist of the 1980s. And yet, much of the film's predictions extend beyond the decade, and some of them even came true. In the beginning of this 1981 film, the audience is told that in what was then the future of 1988, crime rises by 400%. This is the premise of the film and an explanation for all events that take place in the narrative. The film takes place in an alternate 1990s. This did not exactly happen in the real world 1988, but this hyperbolic projection of the near future was grounded in the statistics of the day. Some history might be necessary. In the 1960s, 70s, and especially the 80s, crime rose in major cities. Part of this was because of a process now commonly called white flight. White middle-class families left the city for the newly created suburbs, some of which were either legally or illegally whites only. Over the course of several decades, white families left and took the money with them, and without money there is poverty. A common byproduct of poverty is crime.
In the name of the workers and all the oppressed of this imperialist country have struck a fatal blow to the racist police state.
Early in the film, the revolutionary who hijacks Air Force One claims that America will no longer be subjected to the racist policies of the government, and indeed, the real-world government was complicit in the increase in white flight and subsequent increase in crime in the cities. The Federal Housing Administration justified housing segregation or redlining by claiming that if minorities, particularly African Americans, bought homes in the suburbs or even near the suburbs, property values would decline. In reality, the opposite was true. When African Americans even tried to buy homes in all-white suburbs, property values actually rose because they were willing to pay more for properties than whites because their housing supply was severely limited. When Hawk forces Plissken to rescue the president under the threat of death, this might seem like a far-out sci-fi scenario, something to demonize the prison system by showing something truly barbaric. Hawk would never get away with that, we might say in our incredulity. But the rights of convicted prisoners in the United States have constitutional limitations. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolished slavery in the country, but it has a very specific loophole, a condition. Slavery is still legal among convicted prisoners. That is why forced labor for either no pay or little pay is legal while convicts serve their sentences. It's written into the Constitution. It is why chain gangs could exist. It is why corporations contract modern prisons for lower than minimum wage labor among its prisoners. The only thing outlandish about the prison system in what was then the future of the 90s and Escape from New York is that the prison is strictly administered exclusively by the government and not by private prisons. In the film, we are given a lot of technical data about how the citywide prison functions. Manhattan itself, the setting of the film, is the most densely populated borough of New York City. In the real world, it has a population of about 1.6 million. If we estimate the population of the fictional Manhattan of the film is similar to the real world, we might guess that the number would be rather high for a nation's entire prison population, but we would be wrong. According to the US Bureau of Justice statistics in the real world, not the movie, roughly 2 million Americans are prisoners. America only has 5% of the world's population, but it has 25% of the world's prisoners. Escape from New York depicts a future in which the police and the military are one and the same, or at least the police force has become militarized. According to the opening narration, the United States police force is like an army. This frightening vision of the future is not too dissimilar to images of the police in America today. Police wear helmets and masks, carry assault rifles, and ride in mine-resistant armored vehicles. Federal programs have provided military equipment to local police, regardless of whether or not it is necessary to perform their jobs, and definitely regardless of whether or not the police officers have military experience with the equipment. In other words, the capacity to use said equipment safely and effectively. It is frankly jarring how much this movie got right about the future. Militarization of the police does not make the population safer. It erodes confidence in the police force, making it difficult for citizens to approach the police following a crime, and it exacerbates delicate, sensitive situations like protests. In the film, the imprisonment of convicts in Manhattan is portrayed as a result of the increase in crime, but the militarized government of the future does not consider that its own policies have created the situation. It is the cause, not the solution. Escape from New York challenges the social politics of earlier films like Dirty Harry and Death Wish that portray anyone charged with a crime as a raving punk or vermin to be exterminated. Snake Plissken, conversely, is a criminal who can save us all. We don't know much about Snake or why he was convicted. He was apparently involved in an armed robbery of the Federal Reserve, a crime in which Brain left him twisting in the wind. Why did Plissken do this after a stellar career serving the country? Well, what reasonable assumptions can we make about a world that he lives in? If crime rose 400%, one could rationally surmise that poverty was also on the rise preceding this. His pay following his discharge from the military may not have been enough to sustain himself or his loved ones. He may have been suffering from mental or physical ailments common among veterans. Unfortunately, such ailments sometimes go untreated, even by a culture that practically fetishizes the military. Also, if he was robbing from an authoritarian government that does not provide for its people, how immoral was this robbery anyway? And what about New York City itself? Why of all the major cities in America is it the setting of this film? Well, that may require some history as well. In the 1970s, the decade prior to the debut of this film, there was widespread corruption in the NYPD. When the city was on the brink of bankruptcy in 1975, President Ford refused to bail out the city, comparing it to an insidious disease. Lack of funds breeds corruption, and corruption breeds inefficiency. In the film, this fall from grace and desperation due to no outside help is represented by the Statue of Liberty, once a beacon that welcomed those yearning to breathe free and now a processing center for inmates. The narration in the film says that the citywide prison follows a simple rule: once you go in, you don't come out. This is a futuristic version of real-world mandatory minimums and mandatory sentences, guidelines for harsher punishments, even at times for non-violent drug charges, with less recourse than one would hope. In America, the real-world America anyway, the violent crime per capita has actually largely decreased since the 90s. This is a chart from the World Bank because people often do not believe this important statistic, probably due to the sensationalist news and when compared to the rise in prison population. Prison population is way up because of a lot of factors like mandatory minimums and the mass incarceration of non-violent drug offenders. Characters in the film are representatives of attitudes rather than fleshed out men and women with complex backstories. Snake is missing an eye, something thought up by Kurt Russell himself. He lost something in the war, but what he lost may have been more emotional, psychological, and spiritual than just physical. The President of the United States has no name. He is the face of America's harsh judgment and false moral superiority. When Air Force One is under attack, the President escapes in his pod, leaving everyone else on board to die. He says to people he knows are about to die for him, "God save me and watch over you all." Helpless under pressure, willing to fire on a minority only when he is safe enough to do so, and disingenuous in the face of suffering that is not his own.
A lot of people died in the process. I just wondered how you felt about it.
I want to thank them. This nation appreciates their sacrifice.
The Duke has no name either. He is perhaps a villain, but he still has more fight in him than the feckless president. The cabbie has no name. This appears to be a pattern. He simply is the spirit of New York, optimistic in the face of disaster. He is the only character who genuinely smiles without any menace throughout the film. Originally, a scene was filmed that would have given Pliskin a little more depth. He was going to have to choose between saving himself and saving one of his friends. However, there is a scene that shows there is more to Pliskin than his defiance and his attitude. When Pliskin is frequently mistreated by Hawk, treated like a weapon more than a man, he whispers to himself, saying, "A little human compassion." More than the violence and the suspense of the film, that is what Escape from New York is about. If there is a line that ties everything together in the film, it's that one. Pliskin's actions at the end might be difficult to understand. The cassette tape that he retrieves and secretly destroys contains information that could help America either end the war or win the war. Based on the fact that it is data on nuclear weapons, one assumes that the Peace Summit is a charade. America will only sue for peace under the threat of the Soviet Union's total annihilation. For this, and for the actions of the president, Pliskin takes this power away from America. Maybe, before America can grow in strength and become the world's only remaining superpower, it must change so that it handles its new power responsibly. Or maybe, to Pliskin, America is irredeemable and does not deserve its victory. Hi everyone, if you like what I do, please click on the orange Patreon link below. That's how this show happens. It's also the only way to request an episode. Also, there are other benefits to pledging, so check it out. The information is on my Patreon page. I'll see you next week.